Okay, so we're up to the last lecture for the class. Picking up where we left off. Ford is now going to have to face election for the first time for the presidency. Remember, he had come into the vice presidency by being chosen by the Senate when the sitting vice president chose to resign. I was going to say forced to resign. He chose to resign. And then when Nixon resigned the office, he became president. So the national mood is not that great. Inflation is at 7% annually. There's a general distrust of all people in the Beltway, that loop that surrounds Washington, D.C. In '76, a Georgia governor and former submarine captain, Jimmy Carter, is going to run on being outside of the Beltway and his own inexperience to win the presidency. It was a fairly close election. However, one of the things that was a decisive element in this election was a debate between Carter and Ford.
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe.
I'm glad you raised it, Mr. Frankel. In the case of Helsinki, 35 nations signed an agreement, including the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I can't under any circumstances believe that His Holiness the Pope would agree, by signing that agreement, that the 35 nations have turned over to the Warsaw Pact nations the domination of Eastern Europe. It just isn't true. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union.
Now, the problem with that statement is, of course they are under the domination of the Soviet Union. Remember when we were talking about the Soviet Union's progression from their western border into Berlin pursuing Hitler's forces? What did they do? All those Eastern European nations that they freed from Nazi influence, they put right under their own influence, and they created puppet governments there. This was something that was a huge political gaffe for Ford, and this video doesn't show it, but Carter would make the comment after Ford made this misstep that he would like to see President Ford convince the Czech and Polish Americans of the fact that there was no Soviet aggression there. When the election day arrived, Carter was the first president since FDR to win the presidency with a majority of the popular vote, with 40.8 million next to Ford's 31 million. Now, when Carter came into office, he would learn what many unexperienced candidates to the Beltway would learn once they finally get into office, and that is campaigning to change the government is substantially different from actually doing so. When Carter started out his administration, he did so with an intent to return honesty to the presidency. This was seen firsthand in his inauguration when he refused to ride a limo from the White House to the Capitol for his inaugurational address. Instead, he walked down Pennsylvania Avenue with his wife, wearing cardigan sweaters, and wearing cardigan sweaters during his FDR reminiscent fireside chats. In one of his first moves, Carter would appoint Andrew Young, a young apprentice of Martin Luther King, as the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations. He would also create a federal task force to investigate the issues that led to so many people during the Vietnam War dodge the draft. Once this committee gave their report, Carter offered amnesty to all those individuals. One such individual was future President Bill Clinton. In 1978, one of the biggest issues of civil rights of this time came under fire, that of affirmative action. In University of California Regents versus Bakke, Alan Bakke, who was a 38-year-old white male, was denied admission to the University of California Medical School, even though his grades and test scores exceeded those of several African-American students who had been accepted. See, under a university policy, 16 of every 100 students admitted to the medical school were reserved for minority students, even if they were not as qualified as their white counterparts. Bakke found out about this and would argue that this was, in fact, reverse discrimination, and that this violated his right to equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court ruled that this admission policy was unconstitutional, as it did indeed violate Bakke's rights, but it did grant admission boards the rights to consider race in admission to righting past wrongs. When Carter entered office, inflation was continued to rise. By the time he would leave office, it would be 18%. He would introduce an energy policy designed to curb the United States' reliance on foreign oil supplies, but due to his and his staff's inexperience on political matters, he was unable and unwilling to get involved in the political process for its passage. When it was finally passed, it was a watered-down version of the original. Even though the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate, in addition to the executive branch, Carter's staff often commented that they had to, quote, roll their own majority in order to find enough votes to support their legislation to get it passed. In 1979, once again, the Middle East would erupt in turmoil, and importation of oil would become a problem. Gas lines again would stretch for blocks around. People would wait for days for the station they were parked at even to get gas. Carter's inefficiency in handling the situation resulted in a drastic drop in his public approval rating, down to a low of 26% who approved of the job he was doing. Now, this would be lower than Nixon during the Watergate scandal, but not lower than Clinton's would be during his impeachment, nor George W. Bush's during his second administration. Carter would visit a presidential vacation resort and would emerge with his aides 10 days later with a desire to rebuild the American spirit.
Along with this desire, they brought with them a plan for a new and positive energy program to get the United States off of foreign oil. However, there was no plan that came along with this to actually get Congress to adopt it. Carter would try to rebuild the economy, but unfortunately this would result in a colossal failure. Following in the steps of Nixon and Ford, Carter attempted to fix the economy by first employing a tax cut to help the unemployed and then increased federal spending. The unemployment rate would shrink very slightly, but the rate of inflation would more than triple from the moment he entered office. In an attempt to recover from runaway inflation, Carter was forced to reverse course on his policies, and by the end of his administration found himself vetoing legislation that he had introduced to control government spending. Carter's failures led him to try a last-minute maneuver to get the United States behind his domestic policy initiatives. In a much lambasted presidential address, Carter appeared before the nation claiming that the U.S. was suffering from a crisis of confidence in his administration and that the days of dramatic economic growth were gone. His lack of faith in the American public did more to create this crisis of confidence after his speech than either his domestic or foreign policies. In regards to foreign policy, one of Carter's successes in the realm was the relinquishing of control over the Panama Canal back to the people of Panama, effective in 1999 in the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. This treaty would abrogate the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty we discussed a long time ago of 1903, which had given the United States sovereignty over the area. This new treaty also guaranteed that the U.S. would defend the zone in the event that any nation attempted to deny the neutrality of the canal. Although this was met with vast criticism by Carter's opponents, the canal's purpose as a quick transfer for the U.S. Navy from one ocean to another had since become moot. When it was built, the largest naval vessel easily fit within the locks. However, by the late 1970s, in the era of two ocean fleets, and of course aircraft carriers, which didn't exist when it was built, the Panama Canal was too small to accommodate our fleet. Carter's most successful foreign policy initiative came in the Camp David Accords, in which he arranged a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1978. The foundation for this arrangement had been established under Kissinger during the Ford administration. In this agreement, Egypt recognized the legitimacy of Israel to exist. This agreement took effect in 1982 when the last Israeli settler left the Sinai Peninsula. The second part of the accords was that Egypt would negotiate with Israel a solution to the Palestinian refugee dilemma would soon unravel. In March of '79, Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, traveled to Washington, D.C. to sign this treaty. Once there, it became clear that Begin had no intention of blocking Israeli settlers from moving into the West Bank of the Jordan River, which had been captured by Israel in the Six-Day War. Sadat had considered this land the best area to relocate the Palestinians in their own state. Sadat would sign the treaty regardless and was vehemently attacked as a traitor to the Islamic cause by the Arab world. Carter would also meet with Leonid Brezhnev in '79 and would sign the SALT II treaty that had been in negotiation since 1972. In this treaty, both the U.S. and the Soviets agreed to limit the nuclear bombers and missiles each had and limited new weapon systems and warheads. To counter critics of SALT II, Carter would announce the creation of a new missile system, the MX. This new system would consist of underground launchers that were connected via railroads, also underground, which would prevent the Soviets from finding and disabling them. Although Carter did not sign the SALT II, the U.S. Senate, although Carter did sign it, the Senate did not ratify it. The reason they did not ratify it is because that it arrived in Congress about the same time that the USSR would invade Afghanistan to prop up the failing communist government system there. In 1979, perhaps Carter's biggest foreign policy dilemma would erupt in Iran. Iran was a constitutional monarchy led by the U.S.-backed Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He would become ill with cancer and seek treatment in the United States. While this was occurring, the Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader, would foment rebellion in Iran and overthrow the Shah. Khomeini would immediately replace Western traditions of Iran and would implement the Islamic values that the Shah had replaced when he came into power. Khomeini's hatred toward the U.S. had begun in 1953 when the CIA had orchestrated the overthrow of the previous government in favor of the Shah. In late 1979, when the Shah was transported to the U.S. for his cancer treatments, a mob of Iranians would storm the U.S. embassy, and they would hold hostages. They would hold the diplomats hostage inside. Thus began the Iranian hostage crisis. Khomeini applauded the efforts of the mob and demanded the return of the Shah and all of his funds to Iran in exchange for the hostages. Daily demonstrations were arranged in Iran to ensure television coverage of this crisis. Outraged Americans would demand a military response to this crisis, but Carter appealed to the UN to work towards releasing the hostages, as the capture of members of foreign nations' diplomats clearly violated the accepted standard of diplomatic immunity. The UN would pass a resolution calling for the release of the diplomats. Khomeini, realizing the powerlessness of the United Nations, would scoff at the resolution. In response, Carter would freeze all of the Iranian assets in the United States and asked the United States' American allies to enact a trade embargo on Iran. However, Iran is rich in oil, and no nation wanted to endanger their rate of oil importation. Finally, Carter would launch Operation Eagle Claw to free the hostages. This operation was aborted when equipment failure and a sandstorm caused a helicopter to crash into a C-130 transport, killing 8 servicemen and stranding the rest. A rescue mission was dispatched to rescue the rescue team, and Carter refused to try to rescue the hostages again. During this mission, 5 helicopters were left behind, and Iran is said to still have them today. Critics of Carter complained that his military budget cuts were responsible for the failure of these machines. It would not be until Ronald Reagan's inauguration day that the hostages would be released, 444 days after they were captured. Heading into the 1980 election, Carter was definitely behind the 8 ball. At the Democratic convention, he would have to battle off the last of the Kennedy family in the form of Teddy Kennedy. Teddy Kennedy would try to block the seating of delegates pledged to Carter, replacing them with his own delegates. This would, however, fail. Suffering from a dismal 28% approval rating, Carter would defeat Kennedy on the last day of the convention to win the Democratic nomination. The Republican convention would whittle down the field of candidates to former actor and governor of California, Ronald Reagan, for president, and former CIA director and an ambassador to the UN, George Herbert Walker Bush, for vice president. John Anderson, also a Republican, would refuse to accept defeat and run as a third-party candidate. Both Carter and Reagan would spend much of the campaign explaining why the other was an unacceptable choice for president. Carter was caught in a quagmire as to the crisis of confidence speech, his 18% inflation, and his inability to end the Iranian hostage crisis. Reagan promised to increase defense spending, deregulate government programs, return power to the states, and cut taxes, thus freeing up money to be spent to bolster the economy. This program would be called trickle-down economics or Reaganomics. While he was running for the Republican nomination, his vice presidential candidate, George Herbert Walker Bush, would give it a third name, Voodoo Economics. Whatever name given to it, when Reagan wins, it would work. In this campaign, one of the most memorable speeches or most memorable quips from Reagan was issued. It was prepared. He was ready for it, and when he gives it, it's definitely a zinger. Let's watch this. Let's watch this video to see exactly how he does it.
Governor Reagan, as a matter of fact, began his political career campaigning around this nation against Medicare. Now we have an opportunity to move toward national health insurance with an emphasis on the prevention of disease, an emphasis on outpatient care, not inpatient care, an emphasis on hospital cost containment, hold down the cost of hospital care for those who are ill, an emphasis on catastrophic health insurance, so that if a family is threatened with being wiped out economically because of a very high medical bill, then the insurance would help pay for it. These are the kind of elements of a national health insurance important to the American people. Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.
Now, it's just a little quip. There you go again. But here's the deal. Carter had a tendency to exaggerate. He had a tendency to try to make things bigger than they really were. With that little quip, there you go again.
Reagan was able to diffuse anything that Carter threw at him and made the current president look petty. When it all came down to brass tacks, Reagan asked a simple question to the American people, and that is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The answer to most people, as you can see from this electoral map, is no, they weren't. When the election was held, Reagan would win 43 million votes to 35 million for Carter. Anderson would win 5.6 million. Excuse me. Soon after Reagan's office, the nation's air traffic controllers would go on strike, even though they were forbidden by law to do so. Reagan would order them to return to work, and when they did not, he fired all 11,400 of them. He would replace them with military air traffic controllers until their replacements were trained. Soon after this strike ended, even after this strike ended, Reagan refused to rehire them. This action would effectively destroy the Air Controllers Union. This would be heralded as Reagan's first great success. Reagan would lobby and win for congressional support for a 30% reduction of the income tax brackets. Opponents argued that this would raise the deficit, while proponents countered that more money would come in through the regular taxes because the average American would have more money to spend. He would also secure passage with the help of conservative Democrats in Congress, the Budget Reconciliation Act, which reduced government spending by $39 billion per year. Congress, however, would defeat his efforts to reduce entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare, which accounted for over 50% of the federal budget. Reagan would also oversee the elimination of federal government lawsuits affecting businesses, such as IBM and AT&T. He would continue to support the reduction of the U.S. government, the lives of the average American, and the further reduction of taxes. When he wins his second term, he would get Congress to pass the Income Tax Act, which would lower the top levy on income from 50% to 28% and cut taxes on corporate profits from 46% to 34%. He would also make history in 1982 by appointing the first female justice to the United States Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. By the end of his administration, Reagan had appointed over half of the judges to the federal judiciary. In 1985, Reagan would launch Operation Urgent Fury on the tiny island of Grenada in the Caribbean. It would last October 25th through December 15th. In Grenada, Castro-supported forces had overthrown the constitutional government. Reagan would send the United States Marines in to restore the constitutionally elected government and to protect over 800 American medical students that were attending medical college there. In 1983, Israel would invade Lebanon and destroy members of the terrorist organization, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They were using that country as a staging ground for invasions into Israel. Israeli troops easily overran much of the country, but in the process the Lebanese government disintegrated. Reagan agreed to send troops to Lebanon to provide international security to the war-torn nation until a new government could be formed. However, tragedy would erupt October 23, 1983, when a Muslim terrorist crashed a truck filled with explosives into a Beirut airport housing American Marines. Excuse me, not an airport, a barracks. I don't know where I got airport. The building would collapse as a result of the explosion, killing 239 Marines. As a result, Reagan would remove the entire United States presence in Lebanon over the next year, regardless of international ramifications. In 1984, Reagan's popularity and the rebounding economy would secure him the renomination for the Republican Party by acclamation. The Democrats would nominate Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, for president, and the first female ever to run for one of the top slots, Geraldine Ferraro. On Election Day, Reagan would win 49 states, with Mondale's home state of Minnesota supporting him. 60% of the popular vote went to Reagan, and 525 electoral votes to Mondale's 13. This would give Reagan the mandate that he needed to launch what he would call, or excuse me, historians have called, the Reagan Revolution. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became premier of the Soviet Union. He seemed to be more moderate and flexible than his predecessors. He began to encourage political debate and criticism in the Soviet Union, two practices that had previously resulted in death sentences or banishment to gulags, political prisons, in Siberia. Gorbachev sought to soften relations with his own people through promoting glasnost, which is political discourse, and perestroika, by actually rewarding private enterprise instead of the old hardline communist methods. Gorbachev announced that he would honor the unratified by the United States SALT II treaty. Reagan would announce that he would seek to modernize the United States nuclear forces. Reagan would introduce the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars. This program called for a space-based weaponry system capable of incinerating Soviet missiles once launched through the use of a laser. Although this technology did not exist at the time, the Russians did not know this and had no counter. In October 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev would meet for a summit in Iceland to discuss arms control. There was no result of this meeting. Gorbachev demanded destruction of SDI as he thought it would be used to incinerate Soviet cities in addition to any missiles launched at them. Any real attempts to get SDI launched suffered a tremendous setback when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded on takeoff January 24th, 1986. This disaster would put a stop to the space program until a complete investigation could be completed. The next shuttle would lift off in 1989. Perhaps his most famous speech of all times in regards to the Cold War and ending the Cold War would occur in Berlin at the Brandenburg Gate, which divided East Berlin from West Berlin.
Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure. There is one the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Although the wall eventually will come down, and if you've ever been to the George Bush Library, you have seen a portion of it, it would not come down during Reagan's administration, although he set the dominoes to fall, I guess. So let's go with the domino theory that we've been using so far through this semester. Perhaps the biggest problem to emerge during Reagan's administration is in his second administration, and it is the Iran-Contra scandal. It goes back further than his administration, but he is the one that takes an active role in it. See, in 1979, Nicaragua was overthrown by leftist rebels. The constitutionally elected president was Anastasio Somoza. This new communist government was supported by Soviet Union and Cuba. They were known as the Sandinistas. Reagan, when he came into office, was determined to force this illegal government from power and backed anti-Sandinista rebels known as the Contras. So the Sandinistas are the ones who overthrew the government. The Contras are the ones who are wanting to return the government to how it was beforehand. In 1981, Reagan would persuade Congress to fund and supply these Contras. By October of '84, the Contras had made little success, and many in Congress feared that the United States would be pulled into Nicaragua as we had been into Vietnam. Congress would pass the law that banned further aid to the Contras. Reagan would then seek alternative ways to fund this project through the international community. At the same time that Nicaragua was in flames, war in the Middle East continued to rage. This time, the Shiite Muslim Iran battled the Ba'athist Muslim Iraq. The U.S. was concerned that this continued conflict in this oil-producing region would stifle the flow of oil to the United States. With the Iranian hostage crisis still fresh in the minds of many Americans, Iran would be seen as the bad guy in the Iran-Iraq war. It did not help matters that once again Americans were being held hostage in the Middle East. This time, however, it was in Lebanon, and the terrorists who had them claimed to be Iranian. Now, Reagan had come to power promising not to negotiate or talk with terrorists. However, he arranged for secret shipments of weaponry to Iran by way of Israel in hopes that this would convince the leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, to release the hostages. When this did not happen, he arranged for the direct shipment of weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of soldiers. The man in charge of this program was Marine Colonel Oliver North, military aide to Reagan's National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter. North was also in charge of the funding of the Contras. He would use $12 million made in profit on the sale to the Iranians to fund the Contras. When it was discovered that North had violated Congress's ban on providing aid to the Contras, Poindexter resigned and North was fired. A joint congressional committee would be called to investigate the crisis. Reagan insisted that he knew nothing of this, the profit going to the Contras, to which critics pointed out that if that was the truth, it was even worse than him actually condoning it, as he was not aware of rogue elements within his administration. In 1988, Reagan had served his 2 terms, and his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, would face Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis, governor of Massachusetts. In the end, Bush would win the presidency by a comfortable margin. One of the reasons being because this picture aired quite a bit in a campaign commercial that then Vice President Bush put forward of Michael Dukakis opposing quite a bit of legislation involving weaponry and modernizing our forces. And this then showed him riding around in a tank. Looked rather foolish. One of Bush's first real tests in regards to foreign policy came from China in May of '89. Chinese students would launch a month-long demonstration against their communist government while Soviet Premier Gorbachev was visiting. Over 100,000 would protest. By June 4th, the Chinese Communist government had had enough. They would send troops and tanks to squash this demonstration. Hundreds would be killed and thousands would be injured. China itself would say no, it was never that many. NATO, however, has estimated that over 7,000 was killed. Perhaps the most striking picture from this entire time is this one that I have on the screen now. One man standing against 4 Chinese terrorists. He refused to move to Chinese tanks. He refused to move, and
and eventually stared down these 4 tanks. Unable to control what he had started, Gorbachev would see the end of Gorbachev's administration would see the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a growing separatism in the nations that made up the USSR. In 1988, the Hungarian border with the West was open, allowing for thousands of East Berliners to escape. In November of 1989, the East German government announced that the Berlin Wall would be opened. Joyous spectators on both sides worked to immediately tear down the 12-foot section of the wall. In 1991, to prevent a new treaty from being signed which would dissolve the USSR, hardliners would launch a coup against Gorbachev and elect Boris Yeltsin president of Russia. Oops, that's that one right there. This hardliner coup would create on December 8th, 1991, the successor to the Soviet Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States under President Boris Yeltsin. Now, let's talk about the Persian Gulf War, the first one. The Persian Gulf War originally began on August 2nd, 1990. That is when Iraqi forces under their leader Saddam Hussein would invade its southeastern neighbor, Kuwait. This would be met with international condemnation and would bring immediate economic sanctions against Iraq by members of the United States Security Council. United States President George Herbert Walker Bush would deploy American forces to Saudi Arabia and urge other countries to send their own forces to the scene. An array of nations would join this coalition, known as Operation Desert Shield. The great majority of the military forces in this coalition were from the United States, with Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Egypt as leading contributors. Around $36 billion of the $60 billion that this battle would that this war would cost was paid for by Saudi Arabia. This war was marked by the beginning of live news on the front lines of the fight, with a primacy with the primary coverage going to a new network called CNN. The war has also earned the nickname the Video Game War after the daily broadcast images on board of the American bombers during Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm would begin on January 17, 1991, to drive Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait. This would be followed by a ground assault on February 23rd. This was a decisive victory for the coalition forces, who would liberate Kuwait and advance well into Iraqi territory. The coalition ceased their advance and declared a ceasefire 100 hours after the ground campaign started. Aerial and ground combat was confined to Iraq, Kuwait, and the areas on the border of Saudi Arabia. However, in an effort to try to get this to become a much wider war, Iraq would launch attacks into neighboring Israel through the use of Scud missiles to try to provoke Israel to attack Iraq, which would bring in other Muslim nations and would turn this into a religious war. However, the United States would work feverishly to keep Israel from responding, as we were already there, and we did not want this. Did not want this to become a wider war or to alienate the Muslim members of the coalition.